All right, let's dive into one of the most incredible stories in all of human history. We're going to talk about how the world's very first civilization wasn't built in some kind of paradise. No, it was forged in a land of floods and famine. It's an amazing story of how just trying to survive accidentally created the world we know today. So, this is the big question, right? It sounds totally backwards. How do you build something great, something that lasts, when your environment seems like it's actively trying to kill you? Well, that's the mystery of Sumer we're going to unravel. Okay, so our story starts in a place called Mesopotamia. You've probably heard of it. It's Greek for the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now, you hear rivers and you think fertile, but don't let that word fool you. This was not an easy place to call home. We're talking specifically about the southern plains. I want you to picture it. A flat, wide-open landscape baked rock hard by a brutal sun most of the year. There's almost no rain. There are no forests for wood, not even many stones for building. It is a tough, tough place to try and make a living. When you really boil it down, the ancient Sumerians' entire struggle for existence came down to these four massive problems. Think of these as the hurdles they had to clear. And the incredible thing is the way they solved each one, step by step, ended up creating the blueprint for civilization itself. And that, right there, is the heart of our story. The Sumerians didn't wake up one day and say, "Hey, let's invent civilization." Of course not. They were just trying to not starve. But their solutions to everyday problems were so clever, so revolutionary, they ended up changing everything, forever. So here's the crazy part. The first problem didn't even start in that harsh, flat land. It started up in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. Life there was actually pretty good. The weather was nice, there was plenty of rain. Life was so good, in fact, that the population just grew and grew until there wasn't enough land to feed everybody. So, what do you do when you're running out of food? You take a massive gamble. People started leaving the crowded hills and moving down onto those empty, forbidding plains. Why on earth would they do that? Well, they saw potential. They knew that in the spring, those wild rivers would flood and leave behind this rich, dark soil. If they could just figure out how to use that, they might just make it. But this new home came with a life or death catch. In the spring, the floods were completely unpredictable. One year they might be gentle, the next, a raging torrent that washed everything away. And then, for the rest of the year, nothing. The sun would just bake the ground into what was basically concrete. It was either feast or famine, way too much water or not nearly enough. So what they came up with was pure genius. It wasn't one single invention, it was a whole system. First, they built up these walls of earth called levees to hold back the floods. Then they dug canals, like little artificial rivers, to channel that water exactly where they wanted it to go. And finally, they dug out huge pools or reservoirs to store all that extra water for the long, hot, dry season. They literally bent nature to their will. But you know how it goes. You solve one huge problem, and it creates a brand new one. This amazing irrigation system was massive. It snaked across the landscape for miles, connecting dozens of different villages. And the canals were always getting clogged with mud and silt. If just one village decided not to clean out its section, the whole system would back up, and everybody would starve. And this, right here, is the moment society as we know it begins to take shape. For the very first time, little individual villages couldn't make it on their own anymore. They had to cooperate. They were forced to get together, to organize work crews, to plan for the future. And as they worked together, those small settlements began to merge into the world's first large towns and eventually cities. But as these cities got bigger and more successful, a new threat showed up. And this time, it wasn't Mother Nature. It was each other. Water was everything, and cities upstream quickly realized they held all the power. They could block a canal and choke off the water supply to a city downstream. Fights over water became common, and those fights often turned into raids and bloody battles. And that brings us to the final piece of this survival puzzle, defense. Remember, the plains were flat. There were no mountains or forests to hide behind, so the Sumerians built their own protection. They figured out how to make bricks from mud and sun, and with them, they built massive walls around their cities. They even dug deep ditches, or moats, and filled them with water. And just like that, the independent, walled-off, protected city-state was born. So let's just recap. They've solved the 4 great problems. They're safe from attack behind their walls. And they've got a steady supply of food and water thanks to irrigation. So now what? What did life actually look like inside those walls? This is where the story pivots from just surviving to actually building a civilization. But hold on, before we dive in, what do we really mean when we say civilization? It's a word we throw around a lot. Well, for historians, it means a really complex society that has a few key ingredients, like organized government, arts, sciences, stuff like that. It's about moving beyond just staying alive and building a complex, shared way of life. And let me tell you, Sumer ticked every single one of those boxes. That stable food supply they created was the foundation for everything else. It let them develop a complex social structure, a real system of government, organized religion, beautiful art, amazing new technologies, and, maybe the biggest one of all, a written language. Let's look at just a few of these. See, once you don't need everyone to be a farmer, society starts to get layered. At the very top, you had your kings, your high priests, and your top government officials. These guys lived in big 2-story houses. Then you had your middle class, the merchants, the craftsmen, and of course the farmers and fishers, who were the backbone of it all. And then at the very bottom, you had enslaved people, who were usually people captured in those wars between the city-states. Now, religion was the absolute center of Sumerian life. You could see it, literally, in their architecture. They built these incredible, massive temples called ziggurats. They were like giant stepped pyramids, and they were, quote, so large that they could be seen from miles away. They were a powerful symbol of their city's devotion to its god. And all this stability inside the city walls led to mind-blowing innovation. Sometime around 3500 BCE, they invent the wheel. But get this, it wasn't for a cart. It was for making pottery. It was a potter's wheel. Then, just a couple hundred years later, they developed cuneiform, the world's very first system of writing, which they originally used just to keep track of trade goods. So you might be thinking, this is cool history, but why does a civilization from 5,000 years ago really matter to me today? Well, it matters because the solutions they came up with didn't just stay in Sumer. They became the foundation for basically everything that came after, including the world you're living in right now. Seriously, just think about it. The plow they invented to turn over that hard, dry soil, that's the great-great-great-grandfather of the tractors that grow our food today. They were the first people to actually write down laws, creating the basic idea that justice should be consistent and recorded. And the wheel? I mean, come on, it's impossible to imagine our world without it. Their legacy is absolutely everywhere. Which kind of brings us to one last big thought. The Sumerians faced famine, floods, and war, and solving those problems forced them to cooperate and innovate in ways no one had ever dreamed of. It really makes you wonder, what's the great challenge of our time that might force us to work together in a whole new way? And what kind of new world could we accidentally build in the process?